Welcome back. All right, so my continuing series looking at teams that have missed the playoffs. We're down to the Montreal Canadiens. So we are really down into the teams that are rebuilding. Teams that were not expected to be in the playoff hunt this year. But you know what? I think Marty St. Louis did a pretty good job behind the bench. I think Montreal won some games that maybe they weren't expected to. And yeah, there's a bit of a crash at the end of the season, but not necessarily all that much of a surprise there. So their overall record was 31, 45, and 6 this season. They got off to a 5-4 start to the season. They were off to a good start, and then it got kind of rocky from there. But the last time they were 500 was actually 33 games into the season where they were 15, 15, and 3. So as rough as their record looks, there's reason to think this team could be better next year. And that's part of it right there. They were decent through the first half of the season. They only won 5 of their last 22 games. So it was a really rough stretch at the end. They're not the only team that went through a really rough stretch at the end of it, but yeah, it really took them out of the hunt. So when we look back, this is a team that's been in the mediocre to not bad range, but in the playoffs with Carey Price, they could go places. So 2019-2020, they were 31, 31, and 9. That year they get into the playoffs due to the play-in round. They upset the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then they get knocked out in the first round by the Philadelphia Flyers, right? A series that was pretty close. 2020-2021, they finished 24, 21, and 11 in the Canadian division. They made the playoffs in large part because Ottawa, Calgary, Vancouver, just disastrous seasons. They had a mastery over Vancouver that really helped them get an edge. And so going into the playoffs, no one expected anything from Montreal, and then they went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. So Montreal defied expectation, and then coming out of that Stanley Cup final, word leaked out immediately that Shea Weber had probably played his final game in the NHL, and Carey Price had some problems, which was seen in part as a way to make sure that Seattle didn't take Price in the expansion draft. But what was seen as maybe a fake out, maybe a game of poker, turned out to be a far more serious situation in that in 2021 2022, with Price barely playing, they ended up 22, 49, and 11. They just crashed. And it was immediately apparent this team needed to go through some sort of a retool slash rebuild. This season, of course, as I stated, 31, 45, and 6. They went up by 13 points. So the question again is one of can they get another 13 points next year? I'll say sure. Now what they do at the draft table is going to go a long way too. They do have a decent shot at drafting first overall, 8.5% chance. So there's that. And yeah, they are in a pretty good spot to get a good draft pick, even if they end up drafting 7th. This is a good deep draft. So Nick Suzuki, and there are definitely opinions on Nick Suzuki and his contract, and we'll discuss that. But Suzuki's numbers, I think, are good, considering the team around him, and sometimes his line mates aren't great. He does pretty well for himself. So 2020, 2021, 56 games, 15 goals, 26 assists, 41 points. Last year, he plays all 82 games, 21 goals, 40 assists, 61 points. This year, all 82 games again, 26 goals, 46 or 40 assists for 66 points. So his points total's going up. Maybe not at the rate that others would want, but he's a good, I still think, solid two-way forward, and the ceiling is still pretty high for him, right? Then you've got Caulfield. Of course, Caulfield's season was cut off shortly past the midway mark this year, but his numbers very encouraging. His first year, 2020-2021, he only played 10 games that year, 4 goals, 1 assist, 5 points. There were great expectations going into last season. He might end up being the Rookie of the Year. He was not, but he had a good year. 67 games, 23 goals, 20 assists, 43 points. And as soon as St. Louis took over, his numbers got better. This year in 46 games, 26 goals, 10 assists, 36 points. So he had a very realistic chance to end up with at least 40 goals this year. And so, yeah, I would think that should be the standard for Caulfield, 35 to 40 goals a season. Not bad. And then Kirby Dach really seemed to benefit from the move to Montreal. So in 2020-2021 with Chicago, 18 games, 2 goals, 8 assists, 10 points. And that was after a 2020 playoffs where he played really well. I really like Dach's game quite a bit. But last year, 70 games, 9 goals, 17 assists, 26 points. And the Hawks kind of surprisingly ended up moving him. And I say that because he's still young. His first year in Montreal, 58 games. He's one of the many Montreal Canadiens who ended up having injury problems this year. 14 goals, 24 assists. That adds up to 38 points. Let me just quickly change that to a 38 from a 34. There we go. And I am left-handed. That is correct. So 38 points for Dach, and I thought he played well. And again, Health is going to go a long way with Montreal next year to deciding if things get better. They're going to need guys to stay healthy. But one thing I wanted to highlight too with Montreal is their young blue line. Their young blue line is really something to behold. And then you have a bunch of guys here who could be good top four options in Gooley, Harris, Barron, and Jackeye. All four of them look like they could be a good top four option. And so you've got other guys like Matheson. At some point in time, does Matheson then become the guy who is likely on his way out? Because these guys are going to need to play. And they all bring something different. And I really like the defense that Montreal's building here. I think there's a lot of potential. Now, they were 26th in goals for this season. They were 29th in goals against. So again, we're now into the teams that really, truly were at the bottom of the league. And we knew pretty early on in the season they weren't going to make the playoffs. So their UFA list... you have Jonathan Drouin, who I would think is probably done in Montreal. Belzile, I think they'll probably try to bring him back. I'd be kind of surprised if they don't re-sign him. Probably a one-year deal, league minimum kind of thing. Chris Tierney, I thought played well after they picked him up. We'll see if they keep him around. Monahan is probably gone out of Montreal. There was talk early in the season when he was playing well and the team was doing well that maybe they'd keep him. I think that ship's probably sailed. And Paul Byron, who of course has had major injury issues for the last few years. And so his career, we'll see how far he goes past here, but his career as a Hab is probably done. On the RFA side, Gurianov, who had an encouraging run with Montreal after a really, really pretty lackluster season in Dallas before that. Pizzetta, a really solid glue guy in the bottom six. Caulfield. Caulfield's your big one. How much is Caulfield worth? How healthy is Caulfield going to be? And I would think they're going to try to talk him into an 8-year deal. I would be very surprised if they don't try to get Caulfield on an 8-year contract. He is one of those star players. And again, you've got to think he'll be a 35, 40 goal scorer every year. Maybe he's got a 50 goal season in there too, if you decide to keep him around a long time and you surround him with the right guys. And then you've got Harvey Pinard. I was very impressed by Harvey Pinard down the stretch. Harvey Pinard looks like a steal late in the draft, and so we'll see how far he goes. But I really like him. And Ullinen as well. RFA, I thought played well at points, and so they probably keep him around as well. Now, their cap space for next year is a little bit tight, but again, you've got LTIR that'll help. You've got other things that they'll be all right. And again, there's not an expectation this team is going to be a playoff team next year. So their cap space is $9,660,834. There are some contracts worth discussing on this team, starting with Suzuki, the $7.87 million contract through 2030. And there are people who hate that contract, think that's way too much money for way too long. I think when you look at the other contracts that have been signed since then, in a flat cap era, so it is something you can definitely look at and say, all right, so this was the percentage of the cap when this was signed, yada, yada, yada. Well, he's costing them almost $1 million less per season than Horvat's going to cost the Islanders, costs less than Miller's going to make in Vancouver. And again, Suzuki's young. I think he's only going to improve from here. 66 points next year. He should be in the 70-75 point range, right? So as long as the continued improvement is there, I think the contract's worth the risk. The Gallagher contract does stand out, $6.5 million till 2027. That one hurts, and the Gallagher's offense has dropped off. And I don't know if they're going to try to move that. I mean, he's talked about sticking around. They've talked about keeping him. But when the rubber meets the road, does Gallagher's contract get moved at some point? Josh Anderson, $5.5 million until 2027. They apparently turned down a first-round pick for Josh Anderson at the deadline. So they want to keep him around. Hoffman's $4.5 million contract ends next year. I'd be kind of surprised if they don't find a way to move him during this season, and whether they retain salary or whatever they do. I'd be kind of surprised if Hoffman finishes the season in Montreal, considering they're still going to be rebuilding. And then you've got Matheson, $4.87 million until 2026. There were rumors about maybe he ends up being moved. Edmondson rumors were out there as well. We'll see which defenseman ends up getting moved this season. Allen, $3.85 million till 2025. Again, you have Jake Allen, you have Sam Montembeault. It's decent enough. They're both signed through next year. Montembeault's got $1 million contract into next season. There's been discussions on and off about whether or not maybe Jake Allen ends up being available, but I think they're happy in net. And I think when you look at Primo's NHL experience to this point, I don't know. I think if they're going to look for another goaltender, I don't know if Primo ends up being that long-term guy. With goaltenders, it's really hard to project that. And of course, one thing that stands out is the Carey Price contract, $10.5 million till 2026. So while Carey Price may not play another game for the Montreal Canadiens, odds are he probably doesn't. He won't be able to retire until 2026 with that contract being out there. And players are allowed that. Like I know people will say, well, players should just retire if they're not going to play again. See, to me, retiring means my career is done. I feel that either I can't keep up, or I feel that, I can't contribute the way that I did before, or I want to spend more time with my wife and kids. I want to travel. I want to go into a career in broadcasting. Various reasons to retire. Being injured doesn't mean you're retired. Being injured just means I can't play. So I have no problem with players saying, I'll get paid out. I'll be on LTIR. I'm not retiring. I just can't play. So that's where we're at with Carey Price. And there's hope that maybe he'll be able to come back next year. But again, it really is just hope at this point that things get better for him. He's talked about not just hanging on forever with this, but at the same time, that's a lot of money. And so, yeah, I don't see him retiring. I think he'll end up probably on LTIR right through till 2026. The interesting thing will be if Montreal does what other teams have done and end up moving that cap hit somewhere else. If they decide that they want to improve things, they may end up having to do that. And that's where, the Coyotes probably prop up and go, hey, we'll take that until 2026, because that's how long the Coyotes will likely carry some dead cap money until things should be getting better for the Coyotes. So they have 2 firsts this year. There was a lot of really excited Montreal fans at the idea that maybe Florida would miss the playoffs, and that could be a top 10 pick that could turn into a number 1 pick. It didn't happen. Florida, they rallied late. They ended up making the playoffs. But still, it's 2 firsts, and that Florida pick, not likely to be number 32. So it's probably going to be a pretty good draft pick still, around the middle of the draft. They have 3 fourth-round picks and 2 fifths as well. So Montreal has some draft picks. They've been stockpiling young players the last couple of years, and so that process continues. Again, number 5 in lottery odds. I have the magnet for this jersey on the board. They're reverse retro this year. It's interesting to me how quickly we went from, hey, it's an Expos throwback, that's fantastic, to Montreal fans saying they can't win wearing it, please stop wearing it. So the color blue may not get used by Montreal again, because the other reverse retros a couple years ago, they didn't win with those either. So, Montreal may just back out the next time the NHL has a 32-team jersey plan. They might be like, no, specialty jerseys aren't really our thing. But at any rate, Montreal likely another year into this rebuild. There are some good young players. I didn't get into Slavkovsky. Slavkovsky's numbers not really, adding up this year in his first season, but he's very young. It's way too early to call somebody a bust when they're still a teenager. And so here we are. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section. I guess one way to look at it is, if a player's not legally allowed to drink in the United States yet, maybe we don't call him a bust yet either. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.